They devoted their lives to helping Afghanistan. In the end, that work led to their deaths. After a Taliban attack on 2 charities and the killing of a journalist, we ask how the country can overcome its obstacles to peace. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Afghanistan's surge of violence amid peace talks. Despite the dangers, there are still thousands of aid workers in Afghanistan striving to bring relief to those most in need. But that doesn't seem to matter much to the Taliban. The militants bombed 2 American-backed charities last week, killing at least 9 people. Their reason? Because the aid groups were allegedly promoting anti-Islamic activity. It was the deadliest single day for humanitarian workers there in the past year. In the same week, a prominent journalist was gunned down in broad daylight. This slew of violence is the backdrop for the latest round of peace talks between the Taliban and the US. And while there may be signs of progress on the diplomatic front, there appears to be no drop in bloodshed. Francis Collins reports.
It's part of a deadly pattern. A Taliban attack on 2 aid organizations in Kabul and seemingly increased threats faced by so-called softer targets. Taliban attackers set off huge explosions last week at the offices of the NGOs CARE and Counterpart International. They battled security forces for more than 6 hours.
After the explosion, huge clouds of dust rose in the air and the debris was blown over to this area and the park. Then another blast happened and there were huge clouds of dust again.
The assailants didn't survive, but they killed 4 people and wounded dozens more. It could have been far worse. President Ashraf Ghani condemned the attack, calling it an unforgivable crime that violated Afghan and Islamic values. But a chilling message from a Taliban spokesman said this attack wouldn't be the last. That CARE International was targeted because it promotes Western culture, including its work on women's rights. About 2,000 NGOs operate in Afghanistan. They remain vulnerable and threatened. As the attacks on the NGOs were happening, the latest peace talks between the United States and the Taliban were drawing to a close in Qatar and without an agreement. The US negotiator, the Afghanistan-born Zalmay Khalilzad, tweeted they were getting into the nitty-gritty, and the devil is always in the details. But there was no mention of the increasing number of threats being made towards NGOs in Afghanistan. Prior to the talks, Khalilzad issued a warning.
If the Taliban insist on going back to the system they used to have, in my personal opinion, it means continuation of war, not peace.
There is clear frustration within the Afghan government, which says it's being excluded from the peace process. In March, its National Security Advisor, Hamdullah Mohib, accused the United States of acting like a viceroy. But the recent attacks on NGOs appears to be a clear signal about the state of this peace process. It's not only the Afghan government that says it's left out of the negotiations. Women's rights activists have warned they've been almost entirely excluded. They say it's putting hard-won freedoms in jeopardy. When the Taliban ruled Afghanistan before the US-led campaign toppled them in 2001, they barred women from education and most work. The government says that if there is a peace treaty with regards to women's rights, nothing will change.
The rights of women, I believe, is not a negotiable factor. It has to be there, it has to be preserved.
But it's now getting more and more dangerous to be a woman with a voice. A few days ago, Mena Mangal, a well-known TV presenter and political advisor, was shot dead in Kabul. The attack was in broad daylight and in a public place. Mangal was a strong advocate of women's rights. Days earlier, she shared fears in a Facebook post, saying she was being sent threatening messages, but declared a strong woman isn't afraid of death. The family of Mena Mangal also feels threatened. It's not clear whether the murder was a terror attack or carried out by someone she knew. But violence in Afghanistan is part of the pressure the Taliban is exerting on the United States to leave a country where its forces have been for nearly 2 decades. And even if peace talks succeed, the country still has a long way to go in preventing violence. Francis Collings, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our guests now. Mariam Suleiman Khail is a member of Afghanistan's parliament. Javed Faisal was the deputy spokesman for the chief executive of Afghanistan. Jared Blank was the US's acting special representative for Afghanistan under President Obama. And here with me in the studio is journalist Fariba Nawa. She's the author of One Woman's Journey Through Afghanistan. Good to have you all on the panel. Mariam, let me start with you. The Taliban brazen in its attacks, attacking aid workers, killing with impunity, even in Ramadan. Does this mean, for many Afghans, that you cannot talk to this group?
First of all, thank you for having me on TRT today, Imran Jan. But I don't think it means that we can't talk to them, but it does signal that maybe they're not taking the talks as seriously as they should be, or the countries who are supporting them might have more of a power over them than we might have originally thought.
Javed, why would the Taliban be attacking?
But I do think that there's still a chance in speaking.
Certainly. Javed, why would the Taliban be attacking these so-called soft targets?
I think this is not something new for us. When we talk about Taliban, they have always been attacking the soft targets in Afghanistan, be the Afghan people or the international assistant or aid workers in Afghanistan. I think at this critical time, they are attacking the aid workers and soft targets to make sure that they are entering with more weight to the peace talks with the Americans. As we are headed to the peace talks, Taliban should definitely be looking forward to having an upper hand in the talks. And their belief, unfortunately, still remains on attacking the soft targets. But we, as Afghans, we don't see this as a good move towards peace, because if you are willing to talk to us, if you are willing to talk to the Americans or the Afghans and be part of the picture in Afghanistan, you have to show willingness. And willingness can be shown when there is a reduction in violence, when they work to build trust on themselves, because the Afghan people in the national community do not trust Taliban. They have always been a terrorist group. They have never shown positive intents for peace in Afghanistan. If they continue to do so, on one hand, to continue talking to the Americans, and on the other hand, continue to kill Afghans, I don't think this will take us anywhere. But it surely is an effort to bargaining in the peace process.
Okay, so let me ask Jared Blank then. So we have them attacking counterpart and CARE, and they also told the Red Cross and the World Health Organization that they are potential targets. They shouldn't be working in the areas of their control. Would that change the calculus at all for Zalmay Khalilzad and for the Americans while they're negotiating with the Taliban? They see the Taliban attacking these NGOs. Would that change anything?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. Turkey plays a critical role in Afghanistan, a critical role in any potential peace process, and so it's really a pleasure to be with you. The answer is that attacks like this are tragic. They are, I think, a mistake on the Taliban's part. They're also probably not unexpected. There is no ceasefire in place. The parties have not yet agreed to one. And peace talks often proceed in advance of ceasefires. And so for now, I think the only possible way forward is to continue to work on the peace talks, try to get to a ceasefire, but recognize that that might come later in the process. And in the meantime, it's necessary for the United States, for other Afghan actors, to start to sketch out what a post-conflict future with an integrated Taliban can look like in Afghanistan.
Fariba Nawa, in addition to the NGO attacks, we've had the fatal shooting of a former TV journalist and parliamentary advisor, Mina Mangal. Lots of speculation as to what was behind this, who was behind this. But with all of that in mind, NGOs being attacked, journalists being killed, is it possible for people to draw a line between where we are right now and a possible peace while all of this is going on?
It's a difficult thing because right now the Taliban are trying to rebrand themselves as pro-women, but that's not what we're seeing on the ground. In places where they control, women are not in charge at all. It's just the way it used to be. And this attack wasn't necessarily, from what I'm hearing, politically motivated. But these attacks have been happening. There have been assassinations by the Taliban of women working in the government and otherwise.
Right. And Maryam Suleiman Khail, when we look at the NGO attacks, the Taliban spokesman in the aftermath saying one of the reasons why counterpart was attacked was because they engage in moral corruption, which the Taliban says is the mixing of men and women. So with that in mind, would the Afghan government and the Americans need to throw Afghan women under the bus in order to reach peace with this group?
I think this is a really important point for the Afghan government, for most of the Afghans who live in Afghanistan as well, where that is our red line. Basic liberties, women's rights, equality. These are things that we're not going to sacrifice. We have women in parliament, we have women in ministerial positions, we have women on local governments levels, and they're all very competent women. So we've come a far way, we have a long way to go, but this is something I don't think this government will budge on, even though peace is our #1 priority, no matter what. But these rights are something that we're not going to negotiate on.
Javed Faisal, is it going to be easy to get the Taliban to agree that, listen, all that progress made on women's rights, you cannot reverse if we have peace with you?
The way we have come forward so far, I don't think this route can take us to the ultimate goal, the destination that we are planning to go, because, you know, the U.S. entered into a dialogue with Taliban without asking anything from them. So if you are entering into talks with Taliban, their request for 18 years, you are listening to them to talk to them, what did you get in return? For Taliban, it's something. When you are talking to them, the Americans, when they sit with Taliban, it's a reward for the Taliban. It's not for the Americans or the Afghan people or the government. So first of all, when you are giving this reward to Taliban, ask something in return. That could have been reduction in violence. That could have been no to attacking the major urban cities. That could have been, let's say, a ceasefire at least for some time. But the Americans did not get anything in return. They sit with the Taliban, and if talks fail tomorrow, let's hope it doesn't. Fingers crossed, we get the final result out of it. But let's say it doesn't work the way we want it.
Okay, Javed.
The losses that we have is the Taliban have gotten more ground today, and they are politically recognized.
Javed, I wonder how you read what Zalmay Khalilzad said when he said, we are getting into the nitty-gritty. The devil is always in the details. When he says that, what do you think he's talking about?
Well, to be honest, it's so messed up. We are hoping an ultimate solution through talks to the long or the prolonged war in Afghanistan. But the way it has gone so far, I don't think it is taking us anywhere. There has to be a review into this. We have to look back at where we were, where we have come, and where we have to be moved. If it goes this way, I personally have so many concerns about the future, because we are just giving away so many things in return of nothing. There had to be something taken from them, some guarantees or at least something. Taliban from day one were saying that we are talking to the Americans, not the Afghan government or the people. Still today, after 18 years, Americans agreed to talk to the Taliban, but Taliban did not say anything about talking to the Afghan people or agreeing to a ceasefire or at least something. So I think we have not moved in the right direction. It could be the right direction, but the tactics we have used so far, the way we have taken for us forward, is not the right way. There has to be changes, and the Afghan government should be part of it. There has to be something taken from Taliban too. If we are giving them something, they have to give us something too.
Jared Blank, is Javed Faisal right that the US made a mistake going into these talks with no clear preconditions, not asking for anything from the Taliban in return, and not inviting the Afghan government to come and join them in Doha? Was that a mistake?
No, I firmly disagree. For many years, we in the United States, I myself, tried to impose preconditions on talks with the Taliban. And what they always ended up being was an insurmountable block to starting real negotiations. I think my friend Javed is wrong that we're not moving in the right direction. We are moving in the right direction. We're just moving very slowly. And that's not surprising given the length and ferocity of this conflict. It is going to take time to work through the issues between the United States and the Taliban, the issues between Taliban and the government and the rest of Afghan society. One thing I do very much want to say, though, is that I agree completely with the idea that there is no peace that ignores the rights and accomplishments of women in Afghanistan. And the United States retains a substantial amount of leverage to help shape an intra-Afghan settlement which protects the achievements of women in Afghanistan over the course of the last 20 years. The way for us to use that leverage is to stop squabbling, frankly, with the government of Afghanistan, for the government of Afghanistan to stop squabbling with its opposition, but to work together to use the points of leverage that the United States retain.
Okay. Okay, Mariam, I wonder what you think about what Sher Mohammed Abbas Stanigzai said. This was a sort of closed-door meeting in Doha, only with the Taliban and their friends, and some fascinating reports coming out of this. This was from Voice of America, right? So he says, God has helped us defeat 3 superpowers in the last century. The third superpower that we are currently confronted with is also on the verge of defeat. Inshallah, you will soon hear they will also withdraw from Afghanistan, either of their own accord or they will be forced out. So while the talks are ongoing in Doha with the Americans, this is what the Taliban saying among themselves. Basically, we're going to wait it out and the Americans will leave with their tails between their legs. What does that tell you, Mariam?
That tells me that the Taliban have a strong backing and a strong financial support behind them. And if we're really serious about bringing peace into Afghanistan, peace into this region, and peace into the world in the long term, we need to find out where the funding is coming from and cut that off. I think that's the most important piece that we can work on.
Fariba Nawa, all of this, we're looking at the attacks on the NGOs, the attack on journalists, the insecurity in the country, the fact that the Taliban has swallowed up so much of the country. Is all of this a sign that you should not be talking to them until they change, or that it's more of a sign that you need to go back and change the way you talk to them?
I would say the latter. You change the way you talk to them. Here's how I see it. The Taliban have won the war. That's how they see it. They're the ones in charge. They're calling the shots. Whether it's women's issues, how the international community will be involved, they get to decide. But that's not really what's on the ground, because even if they come into power, they have to get the support of the Afghan people. And I think the Afghan people are really trying with this Loya Jirga that was just in place, the resolutions that came out of it. They also need to start listening, because this idea that they're going to take over again and it will be all in their hands again isn't going to happen. Afghanistan is, obviously you've heard this before, it's not what it was 18 years ago, especially for women. Women will fight back. Where I come from in Herat, women are burning themselves to death right now in protest. And that's a really strong statement. And you can't go back. And the Taliban need to hear this. They need to hear what the Afghan people are saying. Just like the Americans or the Russians couldn't quiet the Afghans with their bombs and bullets, neither can the Taliban.
There's a New York Times editorial, Fariba, which said, well, the headlines, the unspeakable war, the conflict in Afghanistan is going badly and the Trump administration doesn't want to talk about it. Do you agree?
Absolutely. We are being thrown under the bus, especially the Afghan women. We were used as the reason to fight this war.
Right.
And now no one in the US is really talking about this. The media is covering it in bits and pieces. But this is not a subject anybody wants to talk about.
And Jared, to add to that, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, we used to get those quarterly reports telling us how much territory the Taliban has, telling us death tolls and so on. That's winding down, and the US public won't really have access to that anymore. Is that something that's deliberate from the Trump administration? It's, nothing to see here. The war's just continuing forever and ever and don't ask questions?
Well, there does seem to be a deliberate lack of transparency from the Trump administration. I wouldn't say that it's in the spirit of the war is lasting forever and ever, don't ask questions. I think, if anything, the Trump administration is indicating a strong desire to end the war, hopefully through a negotiated settlement. But President Trump himself has indicated that if that's not possible, he may simply pull the plug, which is where you really start to have a problem, both for U.S. security and also for the security of the Afghan people. But a lot of ideas have been thrown out here. The government of Afghanistan should be more involved. There should be more pressure on the Taliban sources of financing, on their foreign backers. These are all fine ideas. They're all ideas that we have tried over and over again over the nearly 20 years of the US engagement in this phase of Afghan civil war. The real bottom line is this, though. Every time the United States has passed up an opportunity to make a deal with the Taliban, we've found ourselves in a weaker position. This is the best moment to make a deal with the Taliban since the last opportunity, and it's going to be better than the next opportunity. This is the moment to try to come to some kind of political settlement with all of the challenges, with all of the risks associated, because there simply isn't a better option.
Jared, would you say it's accurate that the Trump administration is just looking for the first opportunity to save face and get out, wants to get out without looking embarrassed?
Well, I think as is often the case, there is not a single Trump administration or a single Trump administration policy. President Trump himself, I think, has made quite clear that he wants to end U.S. military engagement in Afghanistan. I think that there are other elements of the administration who have a very different view and have so far constrained his ability to act upon that view. And so that gives you this kind of tenuous moment of balance where it's possible to try to use the U.S. remaining leverage to get a decent deal. The longer this drags on, then you run a risk that President Trump simply decides to proceed without a deal.
Right. And the reason why we haven't heard from or seen Javed or Miriam in the past few minutes is because there's a power cut in Kabul. So just to let you know, we'll try and get them back for the last few minutes. If we cannot, that would be unfortunate. But let's continue, because this discussion never ends, Fariba. There's just so many moving parts here. And a lot of the time, it feels like Groundhog Day every time there's a Taliban attack and we try to analyze and so on. It seems as if there's fundamentally something broken here. And the group with nothing to lose is always the Taliban. Are people right when they say that the Taliban's just waiting the Americans out and waiting this government out?
Yes, that's how I see it. But once they come back, it's not as easy as they think it'll be.
Why?
Because they're not going to be able to control Afghanistan the way they did in 2000, before the American, 2001, before the American intervention. It has changed. You have a much more educated urban community, and even in rural communities. I was talking to Afghan women who have traveled in the provinces and spoken to people. People are much more aware. You've had an information revolution inside Afghanistan in the last 18 years. They know what's going on now. They know what they don't want and what they want. If they're going to rule with an iron fist, using psychological torture, yeah, anywhere that works. But for how long?
Fariba, in the absence of peace, in the absence of a ceasefire, we heard from the Taliban, from Zabihullah Mujahid, saying the Kabul attack on counterpart is not the last attack. So presumably more attacks on NGOs. Given the current state of things on the ground in the country, what would an Afghanistan look like without the NGOs? Because I, for example, have friends who have been evacuated from Afghanistan right now because it's too unsafe. What would it look like without the NGOs and the work they do?
It would be dismal. You have 2,000 NGOs on the ground doing some imperative work that nobody else is doing and has been doing it for 40 years. They have the experience. Yes, there's corruption in development and how the work is done, but without the NGOs, without the hospitals, without the Red Cross, which the Taliban are not allowing in their areas right now, people are the ones who are suffering. The civilians are the ones who are suffering. They have to travel to different provinces where there are clinics and hospitals. So I don't see the Afghanistan of 2000, which I went under the Taliban, which I visited, was like the city of the dead, especially in Kabul. And so how are they planning to, where's the expertise? What are they going to do once they come? This is the question. I don't think, there was a group of Afghan-American women who met with them for 6 hours in Doha. This was a breakthrough, I thought. And when I talked to these women, I said, well, what details? Again, what are they going to do differently? There wasn't much to be said other than, okay, we're going to let people go to school, we're going to let the women go to school, go to work, but what else? The details are problematic because I don't even know if they have a strategy, if they have a plan. Right now, everything's about force. We're going to take over, and then what? Bring Sharia law? You already have Islam in Afghanistan. It's in the education system. What kind of religion are they going to bring that's different? It's the extreme one that few Afghans actually believe in.
Jared, Fariba's painted a fairly depressing scene right now, and she's not very optimistic about what comes ahead. Do you understand it?
Well, I understand it. It's very difficult to be optimistic and very easy to be pessimistic about Afghanistan. That said, I think there's been far too much speculation. There is too much speculation about whether or not the Taliban has changed. Do they have a different vision of governance than they had before? Do they have different ambitions than they had before? I don't know. I don't think, frankly, even they know the answer to that question.
Right.
What has changed most certainly is the rest of Afghanistan. They are confronting a much stronger counterforce than they did when they took over in 1995, both militarily, economically, socially. And that means, I believe, that it is possible to structure a peace deal that kind of recognizes the balance of force on the ground and creates an equilibrium that reflects the real power. And what that would do, in effect, is make it very, very costly for anybody to seek to defect from the peace deal, including the Taliban, and to seek a kind of more conclusive ultimate victory. That's what the United States and our allies and partners in Afghanistan need to be focused on right now.
Okay, and I'm delighted to let you all know that the power's back in Kabul. So, just enough time for a final comment from Javed and from Mariam. Mariam, you go first. Final comments, please.
So I'm a parliamentarian for the Kuchi tribe, and the Kuchi tribe is on the front line of this war. On one side of the war, most people claim that they're Taliban, and on the other side, the Taliban are claiming, why aren't you a Talib? Come join us. I've traveled through 15 provinces, and I do believe a key component that's missing in these peace talks is a Kuchi representation. These people are the ones who are the most trained from childhood on the art of jargah, in the art of negotiations, and the people who are being recruited on the front line, the people who are getting killed on the front line are the Kuchi people. They also understand where the enemies are, where they're being trained, where the threat is coming from. So I believe strongly that the Kuchi people need to be part of this this dialogue, even if the government isn't going to be part of it or they're not being accepted, which I think is a huge mistake. The Kuchi people are a crucial part that needs to be taken seriously.
Okay, interesting point there. Javed Faisal, final word from you.
Again, I would go back to my conversation earlier. The way we have taken should have some changes to it. As long as there is continued support for Taliban within Pakistan, as long as Pakistan do not change its policy towards Afghanistan and towards support of terrorism, as long as Taliban do not change, and we see they have not changed even by an inch, I don't think we are going to reach anywhere. Too much focus on the issues within Afghanistan is not going to take us to peace. But more focus on Pakistan, more focus on Taliban, and more focus on China, Russia, and Iran is definitely going to help us and get us to a lasting peace in Afghanistan. So there is where we have to focus more and make sure that the Afghans are playing better part, better role in it than they have done in the past.
Okay, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Mariam Sulaiman Khail, Javed Faisal, Jared Blanc, and Fariba Nawa. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thanks for having us.
Britain is one of the richest nations in the world, and a lot of its wealth was gained from its colonial past. The British Empire was heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade, transporting more than 3 million Africans to its colonies. Now, Cambridge University, one of the UK's most prestigious institutions, is looking at its own historical links to slavery and how it may have benefited. Is it time the rest of the UK does the same? Haider Abbasi reports.
The idyllic grounds of Cambridge University. With 800 years of history, it's one of the oldest universities in the world. But is it hiding a problematic past? The Vice-Chancellor says it's investigating if the institution had any links to slavery and will consider reparations if it gained financially from the slave trade.
It is only right that Cambridge should look into its own exposure to the profits of coerced labour.
Britain has deep roots in the transatlantic slave trade, with the merchants beginning to sell slaves in the 16th century. The main ports for slave traders were London, Bristol and Liverpool. Their ships sailed to West Africa and transported slaves to colonies in the Caribbean and North America. From the 16th to the 19th century, British traders shipped around 3 million Africans across the Atlantic. And they made big money in this period, the equivalent of up to $1 billion today. The profits went back into the economy, so many institutions benefited from the slave trade. The UK passed a law banning slavery in 1807, but it didn't stop completely until 3 decades later. Cambridge isn't the only university investigating its past.
It is our very enslavement of another, our very ownership of another, culminating in the tragic sale of 272 women, men, and children that remains with us to this day, trapping us in an historic truth for which we implore mercy and justice, hope and healing.
Georgetown University recently renamed 2 of its buildings after people it had sold as slaves in the 19th century. Harvard University's law school changed its seal because it had the crest of an 18th century slave trader. And the statue of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate Army commander, was removed from the campus of Texas University in 2017. So does the rest of Britain need to examine how it may have profited off the backs of slaves? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. Joanna Birch-Brown is a philosophy lecturer at the University of Bristol and a researcher on public memory of slavery and colonialism. And historian Amir Jamal Toure is a professor in the Africana Studies program at Savannah State University. We invited Cambridge University to have a representative on to the program, but it declined, unfortunately. Nevertheless, let's soldier on. Amir, Cambridge looking into whether it benefited from or encouraged slavery. Do we already know the answer to that question?
Well, we understand that England overall, Britain overall, benefited from the captivity of human beings because of the businesses and the venture capitalists that were involved with regards to this from the 1700s, 1600s, coming to the 1800s, when finally they'll say, well, we need to stop it, but they still benefited from the Industrial Revolution. So again, there is a visceral connection, if not direct connection, when we look at Cambridge and other universities there and British society in general. So it's crucial for us, what I tell folks, to have what I call a worldwide or global healing and reconciliation with regards to the human trafficking that went on for some 400 years.
When you say, Amir, healing and reconciliation, does that also include possible reparations?
Well, that is another formula that comes into play. A part of that, some people are going to say reparations is a must. I think that, again, that is essential with regard to what we see happening in the Americas and in Europe, and in particular with regards to Britain. We look at communities there that have been impacted by that. Again, from the wealth that was generated by human beings. Again, from the African continent throughout the entire Americas.
Joanna, should we be giving Cambridge some credit for looking into this in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic that Cambridge is taking this initiative and is starting up this project. I think it's really important that we don't only look at the history, but we also give equal attention to looking at reparative measures. So it's about following through with concrete measures. And those concrete measures should really focus on addressing the root causes of inequality, and you know, they shouldn't just be benefiting the well-off.
At the very least, Joanna, would it put a dent in the West is best kind of philosophy that some people have and that everybody else is inferior? Would a more accurate or holistic view of history maybe just take some of the gloss away from, because especially when we see with these populist movements in Europe right now, they have this view of the past where everything was wonderful and it became worse because of this globalized world. So at the very least, would that be a victory?
Yeah, I think we're going through this global process right now of looking at our history again and telling the untold stories and looking at the history from the grassroots up. And that's really painful for communities as they're looking at history. They want to feel proud. You know, we all want to feel really proud of our histories. But I think it's about, loving your community is also about taking responsibility for the mistakes that have been made and for the injustices that have happened. And that's an expression of love for your community, and it's actually a way of helping to heal the injuries that have been caused by this history.
Amir Jamal Toure, there'd be some who say, well, all history and all institutions have blood on their hands. You won't be able to appreciate a historic cathedral or a mosque or a palace without knowing for sure that perhaps thousands of slaves built it and maybe hundreds of them died in the process of building it. So if you start with one, you have to address all of them. Is that an endeavor worth taking?
Yeah, absolutely, because I tell folks, we deal with mythology often. And we call it history, but in fact, it is mythology. And that, again, when you think about West is best, again, those type of notions are incorrect because it's been used to minimize people, to dehumanize people. And then we stand on the backs of those folks, and we need to rectify that. We need to correct that. I tell folks, you go to Liverpool, they had great warehouses in Liverpool. And people not knowing anything about it who live right there in England, in Britain, not understand that, again, it's tied to the full story. And you have minimized the story of other people on the continent. Africa was called the Dark Continent. So you could justify and rationalize abusing these folks and abusing an entire continent, raping an entire continent of its wealth, of its intellectual wealth, taking it away and not taking it to the Americans, and then you can reap a benefit from it. But then you don't want to acknowledge it. But you want to dehumanize the people and say that, no, they have always been like this. No, when that's incorrect. We need to be at the table of humanity as equals. And that's the way that we can rectify and get to the table of humanity, sitting there as equals and listening to all of us.
Joanna, are people talking to each other? Because people don't seem to be having much dialogue here. When we look at history, there seems to be those who are the sort of traditional historians who are saying, oh, come on, Cecil John Rhodes was a man of his time, leave his statue up, and others saying he was a terrible person, take it down, right? So you have those who are part of the decolonization movement and their approach to history, and those who are saying, oh, you guys, we have real problems in the world. This would have no tangible benefit. It won't help starving people. So where are we in this battle of ideas, and why aren't people talking to each other?
I think that's a great question. Here in Bristol, we've been having a really amazing conversation over the past few years. And it's led to a huge amount of conversation and discussion on the ground. One of the things that I've really appreciated that Mike Norton has said, he's the editor of the Bristol Post, and he said, this is a topic where everybody's on transmit and nobody's on receive. And I think that's absolutely right. I think it's one of those topics where, for whatever reason, it's very difficult, whatever view you come to it with, it can be quite difficult to think that the other side is anything other than irrational and immoral. But actually, as you listen to other views and you get a better sense of what's actually behind people, there are shared values, and I think that this is something where we really need to be approaching it with an open mind and open spirit. Right. One of the things I've done in my research in Bristol is to, so I was involved in a campaign called the Countering Colston campaign, which has tried to challenge the way in which the city's memorialized Edward Colston in order to open up a much wider conversation about the historical injustices and also about inequalities today. And one of the things I've done is to look at then letters that have come into the Bristol Post about the Colston debates and to try to really unpack what people on different sides believe. Right. And there's some really common objections that people have. So people feel this is, that the history isn't relevant today. And I think a lot of people don't understand actually the relevance of the history today. They don't understand the ways in which so many of the inequalities that we have today are legacies of this history. They say there's an injustice to a great Bristolian. They say that there's a slippery slope. So once you challenge one building, name, or whatever, one figure, you've got to go and do the same for all of them. I actually think that different institutions serve different functions, and that a lot can be accomplished by starting the conversation, looking critically in one place, and then seeing what creatively develops from there. So in Bristol, one of the things that we're doing at University of Bristol is that we are going to have a permanent position. We're going to be appointing somebody to a permanent position. The first thing they're going to be responsible for is looking into the history of the university's connections to slavery, And we already know that there are a lot. So we already know that 85% of the initial endowments that set up the university came from enslaved labor. We know that the 4 families who are represented in the seal of the university were all connected to slavery. So we know that this is part of our history, and we have a responsibility to look at it, and the university is really stepping up to that now.
Yeah. Amir Jamal Toure, just enough time for me to ask you your opinion on one specific piece of information that came out of Cambridge University. Even though they're conducting this review right now, something they've already done at St. Catherine's College is they've removed this bell because there's a high likelihood that it came from a slave plantation, right? And so there was some pressure and some protest, and they've removed this bell. And I wonder what you think about that, like whether it was the right idea to remove the bell, as they've done, or maybe if it would have been a better idea for them to keep up the bell, but to put up a plaque and say, you know, this bell came from a slave plantation. Slavery was bad. This is why it was bad. We benefited from it, and so on. Which would be the better solution?
Well, with regards to myself, I would say that you can put it up. You can still have it right there. But as you threw out there, have an explanation and give a rationalization with regards to why this is incorrect. Why we are now addressing this right now, because in our society today, we understand that we are evolving. We're evolving with regards to thinking. And so, yes, this is a part of the evolution, saying that this is what we can no longer return back to. We have to acknowledge our past to understand our present and our future. The healing must come about, and that's by us acknowledging what is going on and not being afraid, not having any fear.
Amir Jamal Toure and Joanna Birch-Brown, I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers.
History has been kind to Winston Churchill, not because he wrote it, but because he shaped it. He left a Britain more free, more secure, more brave, and more proud. And for that, we must always be grateful to him.
Winston Churchill was once voted the greatest Briton ever in a BBC television poll, and it's perhaps not that surprising. After all, he did lead the country to victory in World War II against Nazi Germany. Surely that earns him the status of hero. Well, many feel the wartime leader had a dark side. Some have even referred to him as a white supremacist and mass murderer. Why? Well, in 1943, India suffered a famine in Bengal province when it was under British colonial rule. Churchill refused to send food, and up to 3 million people starved to death. He's even reported to have said, "Relief will do nothing, for Indians breed like rabbits." So, is it time history looks back differently on Winston Churchill? Well, joining me now from Rabat is Rokhaya Izzeddin. She's a journalist and author of The Watermelon Boys, the story of British intervention in Iraq during World War I. And Warren Doctor is an author and lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. Rokhaya, let me start with you. And of course, the Bengal famine wasn't just the only example of why people consider Churchill a villain. What do you think? Hero or villain? Or something in between?
For me, yeah, something in between. For me, it's not about reducing Churchill to a hero or villain status. It's about looking at his actions as a whole. Because it's okay to talk about his heroics, but what we're seeing today is that comes at the expense of his crimes. So for me, it's about creating a space where we're free to talk more in a more nuanced way about an historical figure.
Right.
So yeah, as you mentioned, there's the Bengal famine, which sometimes it's reported as 4 million Indians died in 1943, prevented Australian wheat ships from offloading their stock in India while people were dying on shore. He prevented his own cabinet members who recorded in their personal diaries that they were trying to find a solution to the Bengal famine. And Churchill personally prevented them from doing that. And as you said, he referred to them as responsible for the famine because they were breeding like rabbits. And he also called Indians a beastly people with a beastly religion and said that he hated Indians. So when you mention white supremacy, I mean, I don't know if there's a more clear example for it than that.
Right, right. It's interesting. Warren Doctor, as a teenager growing up in South Africa, learning history, I learned World War II history, and Churchill was nothing other than a hero. Great speeches, of course. We shall fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields. We shall never surrender, right? This man was nothing other than a hero. As a South African, I was not taught that Churchill, as a journalist, defended the concentration camps for Afrikaners in the Anglo-Boer War, right? So was that a problem? Was I not given a proper education about the man?
Well, I think education in Britain, it's moving on. I mean, I completely agree that we do need to think about Winston Churchill in a much more nuanced way. And I think it doesn't do a lot of good to think of it as completely didactic, that he's either a hero or a villain. Of course, he's infinitely complex, and he was in British politics for 60 years. But even the example of the Bengal famine, I think, is more complex than certain narratives would say, because there are loads of correspondence where he's pleading with the President Roosevelt in the United States to send grain, to send help to India as well. So, I mean, I don't think it was anything comparable, for instance, to what Stalin did in the Ukraine. And often that's how it can be presented sometimes. I think there's negligence. And of course, Winston Churchill, being a man of his times, I think was racist in the same sense that most white British people of the aristocracy in the Edwardian era were.
Right.
But you know, married to that is the same fact that Winston Churchill used his speeches and used his rhetoric to set this notion of freedom forward, so that even people like Nelson Mandela would reference him as a hero themselves later on.
Rokeya?
So, you know, it's absolutely correct to say that he is incredibly complex with an often enigmatic legacy.
Right, Rokeya, man of his time. We hear this a lot, and that's an important point. Look at the context. He was a man of his time. What do you think?
I want to go back to my area of specialty for a second to answer that question. After the First World War, Churchill he oversaw the suppression of the Iraqi independence, first as Minister for War and Air and later as Secretary of State for Colonies. And during that time, Britain adopted a standard practice of aerial bombardment as a replacement for policing their subjects in order to force villagers into submission. They actually obliterated one entire village in 1923, killing 144 people. And do you know the reason? It was for non-payment of taxes to the British, their occupiers, and it wasn't even an act of rebellion.
So do you believe he was a war criminal, Rokeya?
I mean, I'm not really interested in titles that don't really give us any room for discussion. I think it's nuanced.
Right.
And I think our entertainment industry and society at large is filled with these heroic depictions of Churchill that don't leave space, and even society doesn't accept an alternative narrative of this. So when you have commentators appear on television to try and discuss, in the UK, to try and discuss Churchill's crimes,
right,
they are shut down, they are spoken over, and they're told that they're unpatriotic. So any narrative that challenges...
Let me take that, and because we don't have a lot of time, and my apologies for interrupting. Let me take that and pose it to Warren. Warren, is he too entangled in British identity and the post-World War II British identity that was created for people like Rokeya to have a proper conversation with other people who love him, because they just have this reflex of feeling offended that how dare you challenge our idol? Is that a fair point?
Well, I do think it's a fair point, and I think it's something that we have to think about. And what hopefully more discussion and more exploration of history will do is make it so that we can have these conversations. I'm very familiar with this instance in which the villagers were gunned down, and I write about this in my book on Churchill and the Islamic War. And in fact, Churchill wrote reprimands in 1921 to anyone who abused their powers or was caught doing this, and called for their court-martial, and even threatened to shut down the entire Air Corps, which was in its infancy. And he threatened General Trenchard with taking away the entire thing. So this is, again, one of those complex things. For instance, he heavily condemned the Amritsar massacre, and at the same time, tried to sort of was very pro sort of British Empire in India in the 30s, which was contextually very unpopular as well. So I think there's a case of Churchill that he's sort of very Edwardian and taken into kind of modern times. But beyond that, I do think it's important that we have these discussions that are nuanced, and it's okay that we may arrive at different conclusions. But the point is that we keep talking and exploring the history here.
Rokeya?
You talk about him condemning individuals abusing their power. Would you not consider condoning the use of poison gas against Iraqis and abuse of power? Would you not consider bombing people instead of having actual governance and abuse of power. Actually, of bombing of Iraqis, Churchill, not famously enough, said that he's strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes because it would spread a lively terror. This, to me, is an abuse of power. And just because he may have said some things in the past or some things in his time and may have done heroic actions, it doesn't wipe away his crimes and it doesn't justify his crimes.
Warren?
I mean, I agree, and I'm certainly not trying to justify his crimes. But again, I think it's about the greater exploration. So, for instance, when he's spoken about using poison gas, he's referring specifically to lacrimatory gas. And there's a great article by a guy named R.M. Douglas who sort of talks about the use of gas. And Churchill's photo. And Churchill intended to use actual poison gas, but didn't in the end. But he initially wanted to use for the suppression of.
Just bombs and just it's okay then to use tear gas and bombs so long as it's not poison gas.
I'm not saying that it's okay to use colonial air policing ever. I mean, it's a horrific thing. But this is all about the notion of modernism and technology, and Churchill trying to do imperialism on the cheap, which is what he had been asked to do. I mean, and again, this is what I mean about it being sort of heavily complex. And I think ultimately that Churchill's relationship with the Middle East is a much more sympathetic picture than most people think. I mean, that's certainly the conclusion I reached in my book.
Yeah, very finally, Rokeya, I mean, was Churchill, would you give him credit for helping defeat Hitler? I mean, people, tend to say, a lot of British people and Americans will say, well, you'd be speaking German if it wasn't for us, right? I mean, was he lucky in the sense that he was right about Hitler and people like Neville Chamberlain were so catastrophically wrong about Hitler, so the timing was good for him? Or do you credit him with defeating Hitler?
Honestly, I'm hesitant to answer that because it just comes back to the narrative of let's praise Hitler and should we praise Hitler and demanding of people to praise Hitler in order to justify their opinions. Like, of course, Hitler helped to end the war, but so did the servicemen, so did Roosevelt.
You mean Churchill?
Sorry, of course, Churchill. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Could I answer? You asked me a question that I didn't actually get to answer.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You asked me whether we're imposing modern perceptions on Churchill, and the point I wanted to get to was that did we ever bomb an English village for not paying their taxes? Did we ever replace Bobbies on the Beat with aerial bombardment? No, we didn't. So I don't think it's about imposing modern standards, but in order to look at history, you have to do so with a modern eye because that's the nature of history. And history does show us that Churchill had white supremacist, eugenicist beliefs and that he held one race as more human than all the others.
Okay, well, I think as a start, this was really good, having this conversation. I hope to have you both back on the program in the not-too-distant future again. Rokeya Izzeddin and Warren Doctor, thanks so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Australians face the prospect of a new Prime Minister, but this time through the ballot box. Or in Saturday's election, will voters pick the party of the current Prime Minister and give him a full term in office? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.